got interested in bank-safe time clocks. He's got quite a story, had a big article published in the Bulletin. And, tell us what you know about it.
Okay. Well, we'll try to keep this interesting. Also, I hope everybody can hear me clearly. We'll try to do it without the assistance of electronics. So we're going to begin in the 1850s, where banks around the country are now putting large deposits of money and cash and bonds and stocks. And 1850s, 60s, after the Civil War, the country is starting to get back all united, back on its feet again. So what we have is an early group of people that first started working on locks and keys. And these locksmith, key-type people, this was a very protected field. The written material wouldn't be out there. You basically learned it, handed down from one person to the next, because these keys and these locks, or combination locks, opened up the safes. So we begin with necessity is the mother of invention. We start to have bad guys. And Bob, Emmett, and Grack, the three Dalton brothers, just to name a few, they were wanted for bank robbery. Next slide. Some of the ways that these bank robberies would start is a group of guys would get together in the middle of the night. They'd go over to the cashier's house. They would tie up the family. They would put a noose around him, put a gun to his head, and force him to write down the combination of the safe. And then they would go down to the bank in the middle of the night, open up the safe, and steal some money. What happened in Northampton, Massachusetts, back in January of 1876, several masked men went into the house of the cashier, bound the family. They knew that the watchman went off duty at 4 a.m. So they had 4 a.m. till 6 or 7 a.m. before bank people would show up. And they forced the cashier to open the safe by bounding the family, taking the cashier with them to the safe. The watchman was gone, and there was some keys. It turned out that they got away with $800,000, and this is back in 1876, so that's a lot of money. And there were some keys you needed to have in order to open the safe in addition to the combination. And later on, it was found that one of the people months earlier who had helped to rekey the locks because there were some difficulties was also involved in this group of 7 that went in and robbed this bank. So now we're into the 1870s. There's bank robbing going on, and there's ways to get into these bank safes. And here's some of the tools that the really bad guys used to use. One of them over here is a burglar's mask. I like the burglar's mask. Maybe it was for Halloween, but these were some early ideas of how to break into a safe, what they would need, and how to drill through parts of the safe. So there really was a problem going on here with getting into bank safes. Next slide. Very early on, a couple of concepts came out for a timing device that could be tied to the bank safe door so that a certain number of hours must elapse prior to being able to access the bank safe, regardless of whether you have the combination or not. Don't even need the combination, as long as you have the safe door locked because you have a timer on it. There is a patent from around 1831 in Britain from a guy named Rutherford who had a concept for the timer and lock device. And then later, Holbrook, and that's a picture of his device that he had patented in 1858. This time lock had these 2 bolts that would retract after the movement. Any one movement is sufficient to open the lock. So the locks are built with redundancy. And this Holbrook lock, next. Here's a side view of it. This gave you 12 hours. You had either one could release this. The set of springs pulled in the bolt, and once the bolt is pulled in, then you can open up the bank safe door. Some of the reasons why Holbrook's lock didn't become popular and didn't start the process back in the late 1850s, early 1860s, was that the bank presidents and bank managers were concerned about, well, if this unlocks, this doesn't know who is there waiting for it to unlock. So you could have bad guys waiting for it to unlock. It just wasn't a concept that was immediately grabbed. And they were comfortable with having their keys and having the status quo. So we have this Holbrook lock. We go through our Civil War, we come out of it. Then, next slide. In 1872, a gentleman by the name of Burgess created a patent for what they called a Gothic time lock, probably because it had this little Gothic style case. A double spring movement in here with a balance wheel on top, a timing mechanism here that would release a second set of springs, and a little roller that would roll with the release of the movement springs down here, not unlike a clock mechanism releasing a strike mechanism. Now this particular lock was, although patented in 1872, it was never actually constructed until 1876, when a person named Laporte, whose great-grandson is actually in the Bay Area and has just written an article in the Bulletin about the relationship of this lock and his great-grandfather. And Laporte built the lock, bought the patent, because now you get into patents, and whoever has the first patent can beat up anybody else that tries to follow in with their patents. So there's always that little, you get into the legal, who's going to start it, who puts out theirs first. That's one of the reasons why the Yale Lock Company built this model, and the person, Laporte, had worked for the Yale Lock Company, and this was an 1872 patent that replaced the concept of the earlier version of the Gothic lock. Next. The other gentleman, Sargent, and you've heard of Sargent and Greenleaf. In 1874, Sargent and Greenleaf was formed. They came up with their Model 1 lock, and Sargent and Greenleaf, and this is James Sargent in the 1870s, who actually installed this lock, or a lock similar to this. This was their Model number 1 in a bank in Illinois, and it worked very well. There was great success with it. You'll see the lock has a timer in here that allows up to, I think this was 46 hours, 48 hours, so you could have a Sunday bank closure followed by a Monday holiday. And that was about the greatest length of time that people conceived a bank would be closed, would be 2 consecutive days in a row. This lock has a device here that either one of these movements will push this over to release this latch that allows this roller to unlock and then create a void where the bolt can slip into the bank lock. Next. This lock, also made in the early 1870s by the New Britain Lock Company, and it's called a Pallard time lock after the gentleman who devised it. Next. Is rather unique. It's basically very, very Damascene. It got a nice design pattern, 2 high-quality movements side by side, a center wheel over here with, again, up to 48 hours. These are very scarce. There were not a lot of these made. Perhaps it was not well put out. Perhaps it was the type of lock where bank people were concerned about a company that didn't have the original patents. And I'll explain a little bit as we go as to when Yale Lock Company and Sargent and Greenleaf sat in the back room with smoky cigars and brandy and said, hey, we're going to dominate the market. We're going to go and sue and go after anybody else who tries to put out time locks. So this is this 1870s period. There's a lot of interesting locks coming out. There are companies that come, but they some of them survived, and some of them, like this particular lock, a few were made, but they weren't well sold. And this is very unusual and very rare. Next. This lock is a Stewart's time lock. Now, what Stewart did is he put out a patent, and Stewart basically developed a lock with a chain that moves around. This chain is controlled by two E. Howard movements. The lock was made by E. Howard, in fact. E. Howard made quite a few locks for Yale. They made locks for Mosler. E. Howard, Sargent and Greenleaf is unique in that they made their own locks with their own movements. And then we'll see later that the watch companies get into the picture with time lock movements that have watch movements as a means of unlocking the safe door. The Stewart locks, again, did not achieve great success, but they did have an interesting feature to them. If you look over here, you have this wheel that has Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So the wheel rotates, and you can set on this wheel by using these pins days that you want the bank to close. So you can keep the safe door locked through Sunday automatically, which means that you just wind both of these keys. You have a little notch over here in the chain that moves around to unlock it. Well, here it is over here. So that's rotating around, and it's somewhat automatic. You don't have to do the lock every day. All you have to do is make sure it's fully wound, and you'll get several days or a week out of the lock with the two movements, and you'll also know that you're protected, that the lock will prevent itself from releasing through a Sunday. Next. Then you get some crazier ideas. And this guy, Woolley, in 1877, developed a fluid time lock. And the concept being that you fill up one side of this with fluid, and over a period of time, through a little tiny door, the fluid's going to go through, and the lock's going to rotate, and somehow this mechanism's going to have sufficient energy force to release another mechanism to allow you to open the safe. So as crazy as this patent is, he actually made one. And this exists in a collection of a gentleman in Chicago. There's about a half a dozen people that are into these things, far more larger collections than I have. One of them, his collection in New York that he has is quite extensive, and he's also the curator of the Mossman collection in Manhattan. And these, I got my last two John Errol books I brought for plugging the book for sale at the end if anybody has to have more information before they go home today on it. So this never achieved any success, and it's questionable exactly how it worked, but they were made. Next. This is a Lilly lock, patented by a gentleman named Lilly. It looks kind of awkward, but it had a way to have a plunger, and that plunger basically protected the bolt from sliding over to open the bank vault door. Part of the success of making time locks is matching the time lock to the bank door manufacturer. So if you come up with a time lock that needs certain other levers or can't fit in the door or has not been well established with the manufacturers of the bank safes and the bank vault doors, then your product is not going to do very well. So Sargent and Greenleaf and Yale in town, Mosler and Consolidated, these are the four companies that ultimately dominated after we get through the 1870s and into the 1880s. They almost standardized to the point that they could work with different manufacturers, so you could have a little competition. Next slide. So if we remove the timing part on here, you'll see we have a lever escapement up here, balance wheel escapement, and two movements, double spring. It almost looks like a Seth Thomas number 10 industrial typical movement, and then a mechanism over here that would open up after a certain time. The experimenting with different concepts and different unique mechanisms for time locks continued into the 1880s and into the 1890s. Mosler had a time lock that was called their calendar time lock. Next. This lock is in the Mossman collection in Manhattan. There's another large collection of time locks in Lexington, Kentucky, which I believe is Diebold, either Diebold or Mosler. And this lock had another concept here for adjusting for days of the week. So the Sunday right here, you can see that this pin has been turned in, and all these other pins face out. And that pin basically indicates where this other arm sticks out and therefore will open the safe. So this concept of a lock was an automatic lock. It's ready to close. When you close the safe and lock it up and pull the pin, it sets, and you know that, and you'll hear it go clunk, and then you know the lock is set up for holding the bank door closed until time elapses, except on Sunday where it won't let it open. This is two E. Howard, very high quality platform escapement movements, side by side, very similar to the E. Howard movements you might see in a number 69 E. Howard locomotive or marine clock. So Howard made these precision timekeepers. The next. This is a later model of a Mosler with a patent, Beard's patent, and it, again, used your double side-by-side movements. This whole thing is made by E. Howard for Mosler, and you would set the number of hours over here. So this is a daily lock that was set up, and you would confirm where it's set. Then you'd wind both of these. At some point when you're comfortable with it, you can just leave it alone, and it will keep resetting day by day, and then work to release at the predetermined times. These two locks side by side, this is the later production model of that Mosler lock number 1. These locks were just so beautifully made, and they were expensive to go with them at the time in the 1870s, 1880s. The lock on the left is a Yale Lock Company, again, made by Howard for Yale. You have an interesting device in here. Next slide. Over here, you see a dial. Great. Here's a dial with the hours on it, and here's another dial with hours. Now we're doing 72 hours. So we can do 72 hours of closure. We can set this up to close the door for 72 hours, and then it would automatically open, or you can use this pin mechanism to actually set the time by pulling pins in and out. The white pins represent daylight, the black pins represent nighttime, so you can have the bank safe unlock at 7 a.m. and can have it relock at 6 p.m. There's a mechanism behind here that lifts up and down these rollers that sit on top of the pins. You've got a minute hand on either side, so that helps calibrate your timing. Beautiful 11-jewel platform escapements, E. Howard. This particular lock had a modification of a calendar mechanism so that it would keep the safe closed on Sunday. This is a close-up of that Mosler lock. And you can see over here that this point rotates around, pushes against this lever, which pushes back, lifts this arm up, lifting this arm up, then clears the area for a bolt to unlock. Next. And then this is the previous lock, the Yale lock with the pin movement. This is the calendar mechanism. And the calendar mechanism, next, basically is part of Stockwell's patent. So we got a few people that are really smart with patenting these things. Stockwell worked for Yale. There's a person named Milton Dalton who worked for Consolidated Time Lock out of Cincinnati, Ohio. So his 1885 patent, including this calendar mechanism, next, that has this little device right here. So as this wheel rotates 7 days, when it becomes Sunday, this is standing up, and you cannot drop this arm. It holds the arm from dropping and therefore keeps the bank vault closed for Sunday. So they're trying to add some automatic features. Next. Yale Lock then progressed to a double set of movements. Again, well, that was 2 movements, but this is 2 movements with 2 separate pin settings, so they can work independent, and this particular lock was better received by banks in that they knew that the whole operation of the lock, one side is independent of the other, and 2 setups with pins. Typically, the design and patent doesn't always match the actual production model. This is the Yale Lock Time Lock on the inside of a safe. You may see these around at shows, you may see these around on eBay. This became the bread and butter of the Yale Lock Company for a long time. This E. Howard, what we call a pin movement time lock. Next. I put these 2 side by side because when we get into the 1880s, you have the Yale Lock Company double lock with the pin movements, and you have Sargent and Greenleaf. These 2 companies really established themselves. They quit fighting over legal battles and patents. They sat in the back room, had some brandy, smoked a cigar, and price fixed the time lock industry with these guys in the 1880s at $500 each. So you take $500 in 1880, it's like, I don't know, $20,000 today or something. And the time lock was really critical because banks were depending on it, and banks are very conservative, and there's money in bonds, and they want to have something that looks like, wow, that's a quality piece, that's going to work. I know my bank vault's not going to be broken into if it's during the hours. So these 2 established themselves in the industry, and on occasion, with some success, and at times not with much success, if they saw a bank that installed a competitive lock, not necessarily a Mosler or a Consolidated lock, but maybe a Pillared, maybe some lock that had been left over, they would go to the bank and they would hand the bank a letter from a lawyer saying, we're suing you unless you remove that lock, because that lock, we are in court with patent violations, and that lock violates the patent. And banks would say, oh no, oh my God, well, what can I do? Well, install one of our locks. So they would modify it, put their lock in there, tear up the letter from the lawyer, and that was another tactic. Next. And here's 2 close-ups. This particular lock close-up, it's basically a lever, an arm that goes in and out of here that's blocked by this piece over here. And in order for this to drop down, the lock ticks down. When the lock ticks down, it releases this latch because it forces this over. Either one of these movements will force this arm away from that latch and drop this whole mechanism, which then frees up an area for a pin to come in to allow you to open the safe. And again, the damascening on here, the jeweling and the movements. Sargent and Greenleaf made their own movements. And there's lots of these Sargent and Greenleafs in all kinds of variations, some fancy, some not. Yale, on the other hand, they basically had Howard contracted to make their movements. So these are high-quality Howard platform escapements side by side. Again, you have 2 concepts. The Yale lock gave you 2 ways to work. You could either set the hours from, in this case, this is a 48-hour lock. Most of them were 72, later locks, later design. And you could either set the hours that you want to have, and then at the end of that, it forces this arm to come down. So here is where the bolt would slide in. This arm over here has both a weighted weight in here to come down, and it also has a spring-loaded device in here. So there's 2 methods to open the lock. One method was using a countdown of hours. The other method was the pins. Next. That's just a close-up of the Sargent and Greenleaf. Next. Now, the pin mechanism, which is really interesting. So when this arm is up, it blocks the ability for a bolt to come through. The bank safe is locked. When this arm is dropped down, the bolt can slide through, you can open the bank safe. In order to take this and force it down, you can either use this wheel, which has a heavy spring behind it, and this pin pushing down, and is released through these arms that go to either the timers. So if the timers are set, releases this arm, forces this pin over here on this wheel to rotate, push this down, and you can open it. That's one way. The other way you can set up is to work every day automatically by using the pins. So in this case, next, I've pulled out pins 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, and you can see that the pin over here, 8 o'clock. So at 8 a.m., with these pins pulled out, this wheel drops down in an area behind the pins, as opposed to this wheel, which is sitting up on top of the pins over here. So this way you automatically can bring it down through using the pins on the wheels. Next. And here you see a close-up of the pins pulled out starting from 8 o'clock. The wheel is dropped down. You can see that this area is reduced because the wheel is now way behind where the back of the pins were. Next. And this is looking down on it. So here's our pins pulled out. Here's our wheel that's dropped down. Here's a pin that's pushed in. With the pin pushed in, you can see these pieces that this wheel rotates on. So this is how they set up an automatic operation day by day on this Yale Lock double lock movement. So these locks you do see, and they're really beautiful and big, heavy, extremely well made, and they provide this dual action way to work, because on a long 3 or 4 day weekend you can use the other timer, push all the pins in, and then just use the hours to count down. Next. These are a few pictures of time locks in safes, and this is a 3-movement Yale lock, 3 Howard movements. Sometimes they call this lock a casket or a type movement because of the 3 little caskets of the locks, the way the locks sit in. This is the safe at the front of the door. This is a Mosler manganese safe. You know, drop it from a building and it can't open up. And this is the time lock, again, inside this safe vault door. Next. This is a one-of-a-kind lock. It was made by the Colombian Lock Company with massive E. Howard movements. It was introduced at the Columbian Exposition. There were movements made by E. Howard to build about 20 of these things based on documentation. There's only one of them known to exist. I don't know if anybody here remembers a guy by the name of Howard Schroeder. Yeah, Howard Schroeder from up in Linwood somewhere. This was in his collection. And years ago, I had the opportunity to visit Howard Schroeder 25 years ago. And he said, geez, you want to buy some time locks? I said, yeah, and I kind of looked like a kid in a candy store, and I said, well, that's kind of pretty, and this one kind of looks okay. So I bought 2 or 3 time locks from him. I picked this up, I put it down, I said, well, you know, I can't see the balance, so I like to see the balance going back and forth. And so I kind of passed up on it. Well, later, after I met some of these other people, I introduced John Errol, who wrote this book, to Schroeder. He ended up buying it, and then he ended up thanking me and thanking me and thanking me. And I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, well, that's the only one in existence. So, you know, you have it in your hand, and it's kind of like, well, anyway. So this is a very rare lock, and it's well described in Errol's book. Next. This is a salesman model of a time lock with an interesting concept here. This is a Yale lock. This was a great leap forward for Yale. This was a great innovation to try to make a time lock and use watch movements. Next, what Yale did was they got 2 Waltham 15-joule hillside movements. I think these are 16 size. Put them side by side again so you have some redundancy. Put a little indicator up here to tell you whether they're wound up, wound down, because that's a nice thing to know. and then put a center dial in here for the number of hours. So you can rotate this with a big heavy key. As you rotate the pointer to the number of hours you want, it then winds both movements. It tells you that you're not unwound, and the movements will tick, and this will go until a certain point where it releases the lower mechanism, allows you to open the safe. The balance wheels on these two are all brass. So they advertise it as anti-magnetic. It's basically, an anti-magnetic time lock. Why? The bad guys are going to otherwise get in if we have balance wheels that are magnetic. So we've solved that problem. Next. This is an actual production model. Again, things change from your salesman's model, from the patent. This is one of mine with 3 hillside Waltham movements. I was lucky enough to meet up with McIntyre. He's one of the NAWCC people, and he had information from Waltham. We looked at the serial numbers. Waltham actually listed that these were time lock movements. So they made these 4 time locks. This arm, this whole circular dial rotates to the point that you want to set for the number of hours, and then you put your key in and rotate this to that point, and then it will take that much time to tick down. This, again, you'll notice that it's the upper right-hand corner that has the opening to slide a bolt in. So you design these to sell to the companies that are building the safes and the safe doors. Next. This is an interesting lock and an interesting company. Milton Dalton started to work with the Consolidated Lock Company with patents going back to 1870. So again, we go back to who can say, I have the earliest patent, you can't sue me, I got an early patent. I've talked about it, I've got something out there. This is a single movement time lock made by the Consolidated Lock Company, made by E. Howard for the Consolidated Lock Company. Very high quality, platform escapement on top, beautiful little panels on the side, little brass. They may be gold leafed and then etched panels on either side. A single movement lock. Now, this lock went combined, and there are pictures in here, with a patent by the name of Herring Hall, and his patent was a combination lock that worked with the time lock. So if for some reason that lock mechanism stopped, what you could do is get on the telegraph Cincinnati, get to the Consolidated Lock Company, tell them who you are, where the lock is. They telegraph the secret additional combination. So they only give you the first combination to open the safe. Then there's the secret combination that they telegraph to one of their people, where they do the first combination, and then they do 3 more turns, and the safe opens. But that was there was some concern there about whether that information can get in the wrong hands. Next. So they came up with double movement locks. They came up with triple movement locks. And this particular lock is very unusual. And a quick story. If you're talking to people and you're interested in clocks, or you buy a clock from someone, always ask them, well, do you have anything else, or what other kind of things do you collect? Because this came from a gentleman out in Hillsborough, and it was after I had bought a clock from him on eBay. And when he said, well, I have this 3-movement consolidated lock, I'm thinking, okay, I've seen lots of 3-movement locks, nothing unusual. Sends me a picture and said, that is an unusual lock. And what we have on top is a side-by-side E. Howard movement with a way to wind, set the hours, it winds down and releases this lever. On the bottom, next, the bottom, well, here's the top view windows. So you can see the movements and the balance wheels. Consolidated Lock Company made a lot of these locks, and they were well received, and again, because the patents go back really early. This bottom mechanism here is called a concussion timer. So now this gentleman, Milton Dalton, is saying, I'm going to do something a little interesting. What if both of these locks die? One lock just stops, the other one, the main spring breaks, both locks die. I have this device on the bottom that was initially patented to take a ram, and you would ram the front of the door of the safe, and you just keep ramming it for about 48 hours, back and forth, and the push against the door rocked a little pendulum, and that little pendulum would just ratchet this tiny wheel bit by bit by bit. That was the patent. But next, the reality of what he developed was a device that you can put a long metal rod in through the safe to push this big, heavy piece of metal forward. So this piece of metal gets pushed this way, then falls back, pushed this way, falls back, so it rotates this shaft. As it rotates this shaft very slowly, this worm gear, and if you're familiar with worm gears, that thing's got to spin a lot to get this little gear to go just a little bit. Next. So now we have two sets of worm gears. This has to come forward to ratchet this little thing by pushing the rod against the back of it. Then, next, back up, sorry. Then that goes through this worm gear. Then this worm gear goes to turn this gear through another worm gear. So what was developed here is if they couldn't unlock the safe Monday morning, they would have to get this rod, and it would take somebody pushing the rod maybe 40 hours or 30 hours, although this says it's a maximum of 24 hours. But the bad guys don't have that kind of time to break into a safe. So this was one concept for getting into a safe, as a fail-safe. This came out supposedly of some building that was turned into some old drugstore in downtown Portland. I don't recall whether this guy had a name from it. But this is a pretty rare lock. Next. This is a lock that had a lot of success. This was even a lock used by the U.S. Treasury. This is the new Holmes electric time lock. And again, there's some nice descriptions in here on it. Next. The lock was made by E. Howard. You've got patents into the 1870s. It was patented by a gentleman by the name of Holmes. You have a basic side-by-side two lever movements that work this style with a pin that you set, and the pin sets the time for opening. It will automatically close. So it automatically closes, you set a time for it to open, and then there's also a device over here that really said if you wanted to keep the lock closed, the bank vault closed for 2 or 3 days. But the unusual part of this, the beautiful part of this lock, is up here. There's two sets of electromagnets in here, 2 coils side by side. And these 2 little pieces go up and down, again through a worm gear, that then come out to rotate this wheel. So using this device, next. Here's our patent, 1872, reissued 1879. And as information, one of these locks sold at Skinner's auction about a year ago for about $800. So yes, they could be rare, but some of these pieces go for thousands on eBay, then the exact same thing goes for 500 on eBay. They're all over the place in terms of value, so it's hard to say, but they are scarce. Next. So this is the device. This is inside the lock. Here's the 2 coils over here, left and right, that get activated. And as the coil is activated, it pulls this bar up. So it pulls one bar, then the other, then this one, then that one, back and forth. These little ratchets rotate this worm gear over through here, rotates this. This gear ties into where the movements are, and it takes 24, 36 hours of click, 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 click to get it to open the bank safe door. Next. So, and here's a close-up of the opening mechanism, which is the key to the patent. And the Treasury, U.S. Treasury, used this for their banks. Next. On the back of the time lock are these 2 little counterbalances. Now these guys, every time there's a push-up This controls how long it takes for the piece to drop back. So you can't go click, 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 click. You have to do it very slowly because you have this sort of weighted time mechanism in these little pendulums for it. Next. The ingenious part was this device, which was made, this is the secret device of somebody coming out and sort of clutching it, doesn't want anybody to see what they're doing, so they've got this thing clutched, and they basically open the door, connect the wires, connect the battery, and as this pendulum goes back and forth, these contacts are made. The contacts keep the pendulum going, but the contacts also go to the two little coils in the bank safe time lock. So you set this up, close the door, sit there, make sure nobody looks inside, because this is all top secret. You know, if I tell you how it works, I got to kill you. And this would time out your home's electric time lock. Next. This is a Consolidated Lock company. Now we're getting in towards the turn of the century. So some of these crazier pieces have faded out. We're getting into a more standardized concept of 3 or 2 or 4 time locks side by side, this coffin case kind of thing. What's unusual about this, next, is that this lock, which was made, one of the last locks made by the Consolidated Lock Company of Cincinnati, Ohio, they used a 15 joule, 18 size, these are South Bend movements. And that's particularly rare because some of these other companies, Howard stopped producing movements, and Consolidated typically had movements made by Illinois. They stopped producing time lock movements. Again, really pretty. Next. Here's a picture of a bank vault door. You'll notice over here the door's open, and next please. Here is a Yale movement. This is called a Yale pie. And they call it a Yale pie because the movements are triangular. Next. And then here we have side by side Yale pie movement and the American Bankers Dustproof Time Lock Company of Cincinnati, Ohio. This company, for a brief period of time, took over and replaced Consolidated Time Lock Company. They produced a specific type of lock to go on the Victor safe. So the Victor Safe Company got together with their subsidiary, American Bankers Dustproof. They called it Dustproof because you have a solid door and you have time clock watch movements inside of it. Next. Here's a close-up of the Yale pie movement. So we have 3 movements. That's your redundancy. You can set it up the number of hours, and these go up to 72 hours. And as you wind each lock. There's 3 of them to wind. Then you have a big key that winds a huge spring over here, and this device releases behind it a mechanism that then allows you to open the safe. So we call it a Yale pie. They have their model name for it, but this was an interesting movement, very pretty. Next. And then this is the inside of the Bankers Dustproof. So here is the Illinois movements that were made for Bankers Dustproof. Here is the Milton Dalton patent for his setting the hours over here. And any of these 3 will release this bar, which then opens up the bank safe. Next. Here's a particularly beautiful safe, maybe in a place like the Treasury or the Reserve in New York City. Massive safe, and here is a 4-movement bank safe time lock connected to the mechanism that allows a release of a handle and that allows you to open the safe. This probably had to be designed together to work integrally, as opposed to we'll build it and then we'll see which fits in. This was all put together in the design. Next. Here's a Remington and Sherman Company makers of a safe, and here's a 4-movement lock. This may be a Yale Lock Company with 4 E. Howard movements. You see Mosler, Diebold, and presently today that have these side-by-side movements in bank safe doors. Next. And then here's two variations on a Sargent and Greenleaf 4-movement time lock. So again, you only need one movement to open up the bank safe door, but the redundancy is something that keeps the bankers sleeping at night. They're more comfortable with that. Next. We have here, this is a more typical time lock that you're seeing into the 20th century or into early 1900s. There are banks that still have this lock in it, but the movements have probably now been replaced with Swiss movements. You see Swiss movements every once in a while at Mart's, and you see some Swiss movements on eBay. Over here on the left is the Howard Schroeder clock, the only one in existence that I did find, that I did get away with. And it's not technically a bank safe time lock, but it is a bank alarm system with little tiny feet over here that are adjusted behind here through sort of a mechanism. So you have several wires going out to the doors and windows. And you don't know which wires you can cut and which wires you can't, because it keeps changing what wires are used for disconnecting the alarm. And there are two side-by-side double spring Seth Thomas movements. The movements behind here are absolutely beautiful. Highly jeweled platform Seth Thomas movements. Next. And here's a picture with the door open on the Yale Lock, and a picture with the door open on this burglar timer system. We don't know of any other ones of this in existence, and it's not, I've yet to find a patent on it. Next. Lastly, I'm putting this in. You may have seen these clocks in banks, maybe you've seen them at Mart's. This is a McClintock master clock, and McClintock of Minneapolis, Minnesota put out to banks these clocks that you see outside on the face, and they have chimes and a slave clock, and basically many of the old banks had a clock system with the chimes that worked off of here, and a double movement in here that advanced the slave clocks and also worked the time train. Next. So, in closing, they've got me, but not the money. And here we go, and they may have got him, but the money's safe, they couldn't get in, the time lock worked. Next. And thank you all very much.